The cashier's check tore down the middle with a sound that cut through the entire lobby of First Dominion Bank. Claire Whitmore tossed the ruined paper onto the counter and called it a cheap forgery, her voice loud enough for every customer to hear. The man across from her said nothing. He only tightened his grip on the strap of his laptop bag, his hands trembling just slightly. No one in that lobby knew why a quiet single father in plain clothes was carrying $8,500. And no one knew that one short phone call was about to end Claire's career forever. Atlanta in early autumn had a particular kind of light that made everything look softer than it was. The morning Ryan Cole walked into the downtown branch of First Dominion Bank, that light was spilling across the floor in long, pale rectangles. He came in through the revolving doors at 8:53 in the morning, 7 minutes before the lobby would officially open to the public, holding a thin laptop bag in his left hand and a single white envelope in his right. Ryan was 34, lean with the kind of face that did not draw a second glance in a crowded room. He wore dark jeans, a gray waterproof jacket, and running shoes that had clearly seen a few hard winters. There was a thin gold band on his left hand that he had never taken off even 3 years after the funeral. People who knew him only in passing assumed it meant he was still married. People who knew him better understood that it meant he had simply not yet decided how to stop being married. He had built a quiet life since his wife passed. He worked from a small home office in a townhouse north of the city, doing freelance contracts in financial data security, mostly for mid-sized firms and a few federal subcontractors. He liked the work because it was solitary and exact. His evenings were not full, and he had made his peace with the quiet. The check inside the envelope had been issued 3 days earlier by the corporate office of First Dominion itself, drawn against the bank's own funds, and made out in his name for $8,500. It was the final payment on a consulting contract he had completed for a partner firm of the bank's parent group, a holding company called Meridian Financial. The contract had concerned, among other things, the internal complaint pipeline at several First Dominion retail branches. Ryan had not chosen the downtown location at random. It had been flagged twice in the last fiscal year, and his job as of 2 weeks ago had been to find out why. He had not announced himself. That was the entire point. A senior risk auditor who walked in with a badge would learn nothing. A man in worn shoes carrying a legitimate cashier's check would learn quite a lot about how the frontline staff treated a customer they did not recognize. So Ryan stood by the velvet rope in the cool morning light and reminded himself, as he always did before this kind of visit, to keep his face still and his expectations low. The lobby filled up slowly. An older man in a pressed gray suit went directly to a private banking desk on the far side of the room. A young couple followed, then a woman pushing a folding cart of papers, then a retired contractor in a faded Braves cap who took a seat in the waiting area and pulled out his phone. The contractor's name was Marcus Bennett, though Ryan would only learn this later. At 9 o'clock, exactly, the teller line opened. Ryan took the third number from the dispenser. There were 4 tellers on duty behind the long counter, and at the center window, in the position the bank used for higher value transactions, stood a woman in her late 40s, whose name plate read, C. Whitmore, in small brass letters. Claire Whitmore had been a teller at First Dominion downtown for 19 years. She wore her hair in a sharp blonde bob, kept her nails painted a deep matte red, and carried herself behind the counter with the practiced authority of someone who had outlasted 3 branch managers and 2 corporate restructurings. The younger staff treated her carefully. She had a way of deciding within the first 10 seconds of a transaction whether a customer was worth her patience. When the digital sign above her window flashed Ryan's number, she did not look up. She let the small chime ring twice before she finally lifted her chin and motioned him forward with 2 fingers. Ryan walked to the window, set the envelope down on the counter, and slid it across with the same neutral expression he had worn since he came through the door. "Good morning," he said. "I'd like to deposit this into my checking account, please." Claire looked at him. Her gaze traveled without any attempt to hide itself from the collar of his jacket, down to the scuffed toe of his right shoe, and back up to his face. Whatever conclusion she reached settled into the corners of her mouth. She picked up the envelope, slid the check out with 2 fingers, and laid it flat on the counter in front of her, as if she were placing a piece of evidence on a tray. "Account number," she said. Ryan recited it from memory. She typed it in, watched the screen, and then typed something else. Her acrylic nails clicked against the keys in a slow, deliberate rhythm. From where he stood, Ryan could see only the back of the monitor, but he knew exactly what she was looking at. His account showed a clean 10-year history, no overdrafts, a modest but consistent balance. There was nothing on that screen that should have given her pause. She did not look up. "Where did you get this check, sir?" "It's a cashier's check," Ryan said evenly. "Issued by your own bank. The remitter is Meridian Financial. It's payment for a consulting contract." "Consulting?" "Yes." Claire's eyes drifted back down to the check, then to his jacket, then to the laptop bag at his side. She picked up the check and held it up to the light. Ryan watched her do it. Every legitimate cashier's check issued by First Dominion in the last 4 years carried a watermark in the lower left corner, a micro-print border around the payee field, and a chemical reactive dye in the signature line. He had reviewed the security specs 6 months earlier as part of a different contract. The check in her hand had all 3. "Wait here," she said, and walked away from the window without offering any explanation. The customers behind him in line shifted on their feet. Marcus Bennett looked up from his phone, registered the small disturbance, and then went very still in the way that observant people do when they sense something worth paying attention to. Ryan kept his hands resting lightly on the counter and counted silently the seconds that passed. It took her 4 minutes and 11 seconds to come back. When she did, she was not alone. A man in a charcoal suit walked behind her, mid-50s, balding at the crown with the kind of soft heaviness around the jaw that comes from a long career spent behind a desk. His nameplate read, "Gerald Mason Branch Manager." Mason did not look at Ryan. He looked at Claire and at the check on the counter, and then he gave the smallest of nods. "Sir," Claire said, returning to her window. "We're going to need to see additional identification before we can process this deposit." Ryan slid his driver's license across the counter. She photographed it with her terminal scanner and pushed it back. "We're going to need a second form, something with an address." He drew a folded utility bill from the inside pocket of his jacket and laid it on the counter without comment. Claire opened it, glanced at it, and set it aside. "I'm also going to need to see the original signed contract from the issuing party." "That's not a standard requirement for a cashier's check deposit," Ryan said. His voice was still level. "The check is drawn against your own bank. You can verify it with a single phone call to your back office. It's a standard requirement when we have concerns about the legitimacy of the instrument." "What concerns?" Claire's mouth tightened. "I'm not obligated to share that with you, sir." Behind Ryan, the line had grown longer. A woman in scrubs sighed audibly. Marcus Bennett had quietly slid his phone up to chest level and angled the camera toward the counter. He was no longer pretending to read anything. He was filming. Gerald Mason cleared his throat and stepped half a pace closer to Claire's window. "Mr. Cole," he said, reading the name off Claire's terminal. "We appreciate your patience. We just want to make sure everything's in order. These large instruments sometimes warrant a closer look." $8,500 is not a large instrument by federal threshold, Ryan said. "And it's a cashier's check issued by your own institution. There is nothing to verify that a phone call to your operations center cannot resolve in 90 seconds. Mason offered him a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. "We'll be the judge of that, sir." Ryan looked at the manager, then back at Claire. He could feel with the precision of a man who studied systems for a living the exact shape of what was happening. They had decided, before they had even looked at the check, that he did not belong in their lobby. The check was simply the pretext. The clothes were the cause. He had seen this pattern in branch transcripts and customer complaint logs for the last 14 days. He had not until this morning stood inside of it. "I'd like to speak to your operations center directly," he said. "That's not how this works, sir," Claire said. "Then please make the call yourself. I'll wait." She did not make the call. She stared at him, and Ryan watched something shift behind her eyes, the kind of calculation a person makes when she decides that the easiest way out of a confrontation is to escalate past the point where retreat is possible. She picked up the check in both hands, held it up at eye level between her thumbs and her fingers, the way a customs officer holds a passport she has already decided to reject. "This bank does not accept counterfeit instruments," she said loudly enough for the entire lobby to hear, and then, with one sharp motion, she tore the check straight down the middle. The sound of the paper splitting was small, no louder than a snapping twig, but in the polished silence of that lobby, it carried like a slap. The woman in scrubs made a soft, startled noise. Marcus Bennett's phone did not waver. Claire laid the two halves of the check side by side on the counter and slid them back toward Ryan with the tips of her painted fingernails. "You can take your forgery and leave," she said. Now, for 3 full seconds, no one moved. Ryan looked down at the two halves of the cashier's check. He looked at Claire's face, at the tight line of her mouth, at the way her hand was already moving to the customer service phone at her elbow. He looked at Gerald Mason, who had taken a single step backward, and was now studying a point on the wall above Ryan's left shoulder with great concentration. "I'd like to speak with your district manager," Ryan said quietly. "Our district manager is not available to customers off the street," Claire said, "and I'm going to ask you to step away from my window." "I'd like to speak with your district manager," he said, again in the same tone. Claire lifted the phone and pressed 2 buttons. "Security to the main floor, please. Window 4. Ryan reached forward, picked up the two halves of the torn check, slid them carefully back into the white envelope, and tucked the envelope into the inside pocket of his jacket. He said nothing else. He turned, walked the length of the lobby at the same unhurried pace he had used coming in, and pushed through the revolving doors into the white morning light. Behind him, the silence held for another beat. Marcus Bennett lowered his phone. The young teller 2 windows down, a woman named Lauren Hayes, who had been with the branch for only 11 months, stood frozen at her counter, with her mouth slightly open. She had seen Claire turn people away before. She had watched her stretch out transactions until customers gave up and left. She had not in 11 months seen her destroy a piece of legal tender in front of a lobby full of witnesses. Lauren's eyes flicked to Gerald Mason, who was already walking back toward his office with quick, small steps. Then they flicked to Claire, who was now tidying her station, as if nothing of any consequence had happened. Lauren said nothing. She finished the transaction in front of her, smiled at her customer, and felt the first cold turn of something that would not let her sleep that night. Outside in the parking lot, Ryan walked to his car, a 4-year-old gray sedan parked in the 3rd row near the back. He stood beside the driver's side door, took his phone out, and pulled up a contact he had not used in 3 weeks. The phone rang twice before a man on the other end picked up. "David," Ryan said. "It's Cole." The voice belonged to David Whitfield, Senior Vice President of Internal Audit for Meridian Financial, the parent corporation that owned First Dominion Bank and 7 other regional institutions across the Southeast. Whitfield was the only person at Meridian who knew which branch Ryan had walked into that morning. "Ryan," Whitfield said, "you're early. What did you see? I need full access to every transaction record, every internal complaint log, and every security camera feed for First Dominion downtown Atlanta. Going back 24 months. I need it by end of day." There was a half-second of silence on the line. "What happened?" Ryan looked back toward the bank's front entrance, at the brass lettering above the doors, at the small American flag, flying from the corner of the building. Inside that lobby, a senior teller was filing her station log, and the branch manager was telling himself in the privacy of his office that he had handled the situation with appropriate caution. A senior teller just tore up a legitimate cashier's check issued by our own bank, Ryan said, and called it a forgery in front of 12 witnesses. One of them was filming. The silence on the other end stretched. Then Whitfield said, in a voice that had gone very quiet and very flat, "Stay where you are. I'll have credentials and an auditor team on the ground in 3 hours." "I'm not going anywhere," Ryan said. He ended the call and stood beside his car for another minute. He thought about his late wife, about the way she had told him in the last months, before she died, that the world was made of two kinds of people, the ones who decided who deserved kindness and the ones who simply gave it. He thought about the check inside his jacket and the woman behind the counter who had not asked his name before. She had decided what he was worth. Then he sat down in the driver's seat and reached into the glove compartment for the small leather folio that contained his Meridian credentials. He set it on the passenger seat, closed the door, and waited. Inside the branch, the next 40 minutes passed in the careful imitation of an ordinary morning. Claire processed 3 more customers without looking once toward the front doors. Gerald Mason emerged from his office twice the second time to refill his coffee. He did not speak to any of the tellers. He spoke instead in a low, private voice to the assistant manager, telling her that they had handled a difficult customer earlier and that the matter was closed. The matter was not closed. Marcus Bennett had walked out of the branch 8 minutes after Ryan and had stopped just past the front doors to upload the video from his phone. By the time he reached his pickup truck in the lot, the clip was already posted to 2 community forums and 1 neighborhood social page with a caption that read, "Only watch this teller tear up a man's check at First Dominion downtown." Marcus had done it because the man at the counter had stood quietly through something that should never have happened to anyone, and because he had watched the same kind of treatment in different uniforms and different lobbies all his life. By the time he sat down to lunch, the video had been shared 1,100 times. Out in the parking lot, Ryan remained in his sedan for nearly an hour. He answered 3 emails and drafted a brief internal memo to Whitfield outlining the preliminary findings. At 10:15, a black SUV pulled into the lot and parked 2 spaces away. 2 people stepped out, a woman in a dark pantsuit carrying a leather folio, and a man in a navy coat with a corporate badge already clipped to his lapel. They were the first of the audit team Whitfield had promised. Ryan rolled down his window. The woman walked over and handed him a sealed envelope. Inside were updated credentials, a temporary access card for the branch's back systems, and a single page of authorization signed by Whitfield himself. Ryan slipped the credentials into his inside pocket and told her to wait in the SUV until he gave the signal. At 10:36, he stepped out of his car. He walked back across the lot at the same unhurried pace. He pushed through the revolving doors. The lobby was warmer now, full of the small daily noise of a working branch. Lauren Hayes was the first person to see him come in. Her face did not change, but her hand stopped for half a second on the keyboard before resuming. Claire was scrolling through her terminal, and the digital sign above her window was already blinking the next number in line. Ryan did not take a number. He walked directly to the center of the lobby, stopped beside the velvet rope, and pulled the leather folio from his jacket. He opened it, removed the laminated identification card inside, and clipped it to the breast pocket of his gray waterproof jacket. The card was navy blue, with the Meridian Financial corporate seal embossed in silver. The title under his photograph read, "Senior Risk Auditor, Internal Compliance Division." Claire's head lifted, drawn by something in the quiet of the lobby that her instincts could not name. Her eyes found him standing in the middle of the floor. They traveled to the card on his jacket. They stayed there. "Ms. Whitmore," Ryan said in the same even tone he had used at her window an hour earlier. "I'd like you to call Mr. Mason out of his office, please." Claire's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Ryan crossed to the manager's office himself, knocked once, and stepped inside. The audit team came in through the revolving doors 30 seconds later, 4 of them in dark suits, moving with the practiced calm of people who had done this exact walk in a dozen other lobbies. Gerald Mason was on his phone when Ryan opened the door. He looked up, took in the badge clipped to Ryan's jacket, and went very still. "Mr. Mason," Ryan said, "please end your call." Mason ended his call. "Effective immediately," Ryan said, "this branch is under an audit hold issued by the Office of the Senior Vice President of Internal Audit at Meridian Financial. My team has the authority to pull the security footage, all teller workstation logs for the last 24 months, every internal complaint filed against this branch in the same period, and a list of every transaction handled at Window 4 during Claire Whitmore's shifts. They will be assembling that material in your conference room within the hour." Mason's face had gone the color of old paper. "Mr. Cole, this morning, there was a misunderstanding." "There was no misunderstanding," Ryan said. "There was a transaction." He turned and walked out. In the lobby, the audit team was already in position. Two had taken the small interview office near the back. One was standing beside Claire's window with a tablet, asking her in a tone of professional courtesy to step away from her terminal. Claire did not move at first. Her eyes searched the room for Gerald Mason, and when she could not find him, they searched for anyone else who might intervene. No one did. Lauren Hayes was already locking her own drawer, hands, steady eyes lowered. "I need you to step away from the terminal, Ms. Whitmore," the auditor said again. Claire stepped away from the terminal. Ryan went into the conference room. He sat at the head of the long table and opened his laptop. The audit team pulled the requested materials from the branch's systems and brought them in stack by stack. Ryan began with the teller workstation log for Window 4 for the last 6 months and read it in silence for 40 minutes. What he found was not subtle. Window 4 had processed 19% fewer transactions than the average of the other 3 windows, despite being staffed by the most senior teller in the branch. The cancellation rate at Window 4 was 3 times the branch average. Customer wait times ran 4 minutes longer per transaction. Buried in the log notes and small abbreviated entries Claire had typed in herself were dozens of small flags. ID insufficient, document questionable, customer uncooperative, customer referred. None tied to any actual fraud finding, none escalated to compliance. They were notes she had typed in to justify, after the fact, transactions she had decided not to complete. He moved to the complaint logs next. Over the last 2 years, there had been 31 formal complaints filed against the downtown branch. 23 named Window 4. Of those, 18 described the same pattern: a customer arriving without an appointment, dressed in a way that suggested modest income, attempting a deposit or withdrawal of moderate size, and being subjected to delays requests for unusual documentation or outright refusal. 2 complaints used the word humiliated. One used harassed. Everyone had been closed at the branch level by Gerald Mason. None had been forwarded to corporate compliance. The disposition notes on all 18 read in identical language, reviewed with staff. No corrective action required. Ryan leaned back in his chair. He looked at the framed stock photograph on the wall, an oak tree above the corporate tagline, "People First." Since 1948. Then he opened a secure message to Whitfield. The downtown branch had not had one bad teller. It had had a culture. And the manager whose name was on the door had been hiding that culture one complaint at a time for at least 2 years. By the early afternoon, the video Marcus Bennett had uploaded had crossed 40,000 views. By 3 o'clock, it had been picked up by a local Atlanta news affiliate, which ran it with the Kyron teller tears customers' check in public during a brief consumer segment. By 5 o'clock, it had been embedded in 2 larger national stories about banking discrimination, a still frame of Claire's hands holding the torn check used as the lead image. The bank's corporate communications office issued a 1-sentence statement saying they were aware of the situation and that an investigation was underway. The statement named no one. It made the situation worse. In the conference room, Ryan watched the footage from the lobby cameras in slow, methodical passes. The morning recording showed everything Marcus Bennett's phone had captured, and more. It showed Gerald Mason's small nod to Claire before she returned to her window. It showed the assistant manager not lifting her head when the check tore. It showed Lauren Hayes flinch. It also showed in the half hour before Ryan had arrived a different transaction at window 4. An older woman in a knee-length brown coat had approached Claire's window, holding a passbook and a handful of folded bills. Claire had told her, after some keystrokes and a long look, that the system could not verify her current address and that she would need to come back with a recent utility bill. The woman had nodded and turned away. Ryan watched her walk slowly across the lobby, stop near the front doors and stand looking at the floor before she stepped outside. He froze the frame. He noted the timestamp. He pulled up the corresponding workstation log and matched the entry. The woman's name was Eleanor Briggs. The note Claire had typed read, "Address unverified, customer referred." The address on file had been current for 11 years. Eleanor Briggs had not been referred. She had been turned away. By the end of the afternoon, the list of similar incidents had 26 names on it. Ryan gave the list to one of the auditors and asked her to begin contacting each of them, starting with Eleanor Briggs. There was one more line of inquiry he wanted before close of business. He stepped out of the conference room and crossed the back hallway to the small staff break room, where Lauren Hayes was standing alone beside the coffee machine. Her hands were wrapped around a paper cup she had not yet drunk from. "Ms. Hayes," Ryan said, "could I have a few minutes?" Lauren set the cup down. She did not ask what it was about. What she told him over the next 20 minutes filled in the corners of every transcript already on the table. She had watched Claire turn customers away over coats and shoes. She had heard Claire describe certain regulars by neighborhood rather than by name. She had once raised a concern gently to Mason after an incident with a man trying to cash a disability check, and had been told that the senior tellers had years of judgment behind them, and that her job was to learn from that judgment, not question it. She had not raised another concern since. Ryan thanked her. He asked if she would put it in a signed statement. She said yes without thinking, and then said yes again more firmly after she had thought. By 4:15, the lobby had been closed to the public. A printed sign on the front door read, "Branch temporarily closed for internal review." Claire had been escorted to a small interview office near the back and asked to wait. Gerald Mason had been moved to his own office and asked to remain there. Both of them in their separate rooms were spending the afternoon constructing the version of events they intended to tell when somebody finally came to ask. Ryan's phone rang. The screen showed Whitfield's name. He stepped out into the back hallway to take the call. "Ryan," Whitfield said. His voice was tight. "I need you to listen carefully." "Go ahead." "Corporate counsel is in this room with me. So is the chief operating officer. The video has crossed 500,000 views. 2 reporters from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution have already contacted our press office. So has CNBC. The executive team has decided how it wants to handle it." Ryan waited. "They want to settle this quickly. They want a payment to Mr. Cole that's substantial enough to make this go away. They want Claire Whitmore reassigned, not terminated. They want Gerald Mason to be given the option of early retirement. And they want the audit findings sealed pending a formal review that is, in their words, expected to take 6 to 9 months. There was a flat note in Whitfield's voice that Ryan had not heard before. He understood it. "They want it buried," Ryan said. "They want it managed." "That's the same thing." Whitfield did not contradict him. "I need to know how you intend to proceed." Ryan walked to the small window at the end of the hallway. It looked out on a service alley, a chain-link fence, a dumpster weeds growing up through the cracks of the asphalt. He thought about Eleanor Briggs standing in the lobby in her brown coat, looking down at the floor. He thought about Lauren Hayes setting down a paper cup and agreeing to sign her name. He thought about the man he himself had been at Claire Whitmore's window, with the check in his hand and his face composed, and how, for one brief moment that morning, He had felt himself become every customer in those 18 folders all at once. "Tell them no," Ryan said. "Ryan, tell them no, David. I'm not interested in a settlement. I don't want a payment. I won't sign a non-disclosure on the audit findings, and I won't agree to a 6-month seal. This morning was not a single bad day from a single bad teller. It was a pattern, and the manager knew, and corporate is going to know by the end of this week whether they like it or not. If they try to bury it now, the video alone will make them look 10 times worse when the rest of it comes out. And it will come out. You understand what you're asking me to walk back into that room?" "I understand exactly. They hired me to find this. I found it. If they wanted the kind of audit that would protect their share price more than their customers, they should have hired a different auditor." There was a beat of silence on the line. Then Whitfield said, "All right, I'll tell them. But Ryan, if they overrule me on this, I won't be able to protect the scope of your access. They will narrow it, and they will narrow it tonight." "Then we move fast," Ryan said. "Pull the complaints into a packaged brief. Get the customer and staff statements on the record before close of business, and keep me on the line until I tell you we're done." He ended the call and went back into the conference room and opened a new document on his laptop, and he began to write. In the small interview office at the other end of the building, Claire was telling one of the auditors, in a tight, controlled voice, that she had been doing her job, that the man at her window had refused to provide adequate documentation, that the bank had policies, that she had 19 years of clean service. The auditor took notes. She did not tell Claire that her workstation log was already printed and bound on the conference room table, or that Eleanor Briggs had just agreed on the phone to come into the branch the next morning at 9 and tell her own story, or that one of Claire's own colleagues had already signed a statement that named her by name. By 6 o'clock that evening, the local affiliate's video had crossed 1.5 million views. The national pickup had begun, and in a glass-walled boardroom on the 32nd floor of a building in Midtown, 6 executives were sitting around a polished table looking at Whitfield, who had just finished telling them that the auditor on the ground was not going to cooperate with their containment plan, and that they had perhaps 2 days at the outside to decide whether they wanted to be the bank that fixed the problem or the bank that got caught trying to hide it. The room was very quiet. Then the chief operating officer set down her pen, looked across the table at the chief legal officer, and said, "Get me the chief executive on the phone." Tonight. That phone call connected at 9 the same evening. By 6 the following morning, the chief executive of First Dominion had called Whitfield himself. By 7, an emergency meeting had been scheduled on the 32nd floor of the Meridian Financial Tower. By 7:30, Ryan was in the back of a black town car heading north on Peachtree Street, the leather folio on the seat beside him, and the bound audit brief he had finished at 3 in the morning resting on top of it. He had not slept. He had gone home at midnight, changed into a charcoal suit, eaten half a sandwich standing at the kitchen counter, and worked until dawn. The brief on the seat beside him ran to 74 pages. It contained the full transaction logs from Window 4, the 18 complaints that matched the pattern, the disposition notes Gerald Mason had typed himself, the time-stamped lobby footage of Eleanor Briggs being turned away, the signed statement Lauren Hayes had given the night before, and the signed statements of 9 customers his audit team had reached in the previous 12 hours. The brief contained no opinions. It contained dates, times, line items, and names. At 7:48, he stepped out of the car into the sharp morning sun and rode the elevator to the 32nd floor. Whitfield was already in the carpeted hallway, in a dark blue suit, holding a cup of coffee he had clearly forgotten to drink. "They're inside," Whitfield said. "Chief Executive, Chief Operating Officer, Chief Legal Officer, Head of Consumer Banking, Head of Corporate Communications. The chairman is on video link from Charlotte. And the position. They moved overnight. The chief executive wants the audit findings on the table. He wants to see what we actually have before he makes a decision." "Good." They went inside. The boardroom had a long table of dark wood and a wall of glass overlooking the city. 5 people were seated around the table. None of them stood when Ryan walked in. The chief executive, a tall man with silver hair and the careful eyes of someone who had spent his career managing other people's mistakes, gestured to the empty chair at the side. "Mr. Cole," he said, "thank you for coming on short notice." Ryan sat. He set the bound brief on the table in front of him, opened it to the executive summary, and laid his hand flat across the page. "Before we begin, I want to be clear about why I'm here. I was hired to assess the operational risk at the downtown Atlanta branch. I have completed that assessment. The findings in this brief are the findings of an internal audit conducted under the authority of the Senior Vice President of Internal Audit, with full access to the branch's records over the last 24 months. They are not my personal opinions. They are documentary findings. I'd like to walk you through them." He did. He spent 42 minutes on the brief. He did not raise his voice. He read the numbers from window 4. He laid out the 18 complaints in chronological order. He played a 30-second clip of the lobby footage of Eleanor Briggs being turned away, and then a parallel clip from 3 weeks earlier of a different customer in a similar coat being asked for the same impossible documentation. He read the disposition note Mason had typed on each of the 18, the same 15 words, copied and pasted. He read the relevant sentences from Lauren Hayes' statement. He used no adjectives. He simply read what was on the page and let the room sit with it. When he was finished, the chief legal officer, a woman with short silver hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, was the first to speak. "Mr. Cole, how many of the customers in these 18 complaints would you describe as fitting a similar demographic profile?" 16 of the 18, Ryan said. Working-class modest dress, no prior history of disputes with the bank. 2 of them were veterans. 4 were retired. Most were long-standing customers of First Dominion. None had ever filed a complaint at any other branch. And the destruction of the cashier's check yesterday morning was the first event of its kind in the workstation log. The earlier transactions followed a pattern of delay and refusal. The destruction of the instrument was, in my assessment, the escalation of an existing pattern under pressure. It was also a felony under state law and a violation of federal regulation governing the handling of negotiable instruments. The chairman's face on the screen at the end of the room had not moved since Ryan had entered. It moved now. "Mr. Cole." "Sir, yesterday afternoon, this company considered offering you a private settlement to keep the audit findings confidential, pending an extended review. I want you to know that I personally approved that consideration. I want you to know that I no longer do. The decision in this room this morning is mine, and I take full responsibility for it. What do you recommend?" 3 things, Ryan said. First, the immediate termination of Claire Whitmore and her referral to the appropriate state and federal authorities for the destruction of a legal instrument and for sustained violations of the bank's customer service code. Second, the termination of Gerald Mason for the cover-up of repeated complaints over a 2-year period and for failure to escalate documented misconduct under his direct supervision. Third, the full reorganization of the downtown branch under interim management, the reopening of all 18 affected customer files, and a public statement that acknowledges by name the pattern that this audit uncovered. No NDAs, no sealed findings, full disclosure. Tsigonan, the head of corporate communications, shifted in his seat. "Mr. Cole, a full public disclosure of an internal audit of this nature will be unprecedented. The share price will take a meaningful hit." "The video has already done that," Ryan said. "The question is whether the bank takes its hit in the next 48 hours as the institution that found the problem and fixed it, or in the next 6 months as the institution that tried to hide it and failed. The second outcome is significantly more expensive." The chief executive looked at the chairman on the screen. The chairman gave a small nod. "Do it," the chief executive said. "All 3 recommendations. Today." They did it that day. That same morning, Eleanor Briggs arrived at the downtown branch at 5 minutes before 9 as she had promised, in the same knee-length brown coat. An auditor met her at the door and walked her to the conference room. Her statement took an hour to give and was added to the brief before noon. By 11 o'clock, Claire had been called into a small conference room at the downtown branch, where the chief legal officer of Meridian Financial and the head of human resources for First Dominion's southeastern region were waiting for her. She walked in expecting to be reassigned, perhaps suspended, perhaps written up. She walked out 27 minutes later with her employment terminated, for cause her name flagged in the Central Banking Industry Employment Registry, and a formal referral pending with the Fulton County District Attorney's Office for the willful destruction of a negotiable instrument. She gathered the small contents of her drawer in silence. She passed Lauren Hayes on the way out and kept her face turned toward the door. Outside, a small cluster of local reporters had been waiting since dawn. Claire walked past them with her face turned toward the parking lot. One of them called out her name. She got into her car, sat with her hands on the steering wheel, and then drove away. Inside the office Gerald Mason had occupied for 9 years, the conversation took longer. Mason argued first quietly, and then with rising desperation, that he had followed branch protocol, that the complaints had been minor, that no one had told him a different procedure was required. The chief legal officer showed him the 18 disposition notes, each with his electronic signature attached, and the 3 formal escalations from corporate compliance over the same period, asking him to explain branch-level complaint patterns, each of which he had answered with 2 sentences and no underlying data. By the end of the meeting, he had stopped arguing. He signed the documents placed in front of him and left through the back service door so that he would not have to walk through the lobby. At 1 o'clock that afternoon, Meridian Financial released a public statement. It named the downtown Atlanta branch. It named both terminated employees. It described in plain language the pattern of conduct the audit had uncovered. It acknowledged that 18 specific customers had been mistreated over a period of approximately 2 years, that their complaints had been mishandled at the branch level, and that the bank would be reaching out to each of them directly to make restitution and to issue a personal apology. It announced the immediate reorganization of the downtown branch under interim leadership and a system-wide review of complaint handling at every retail location in the Southeast. The statement did not name Ryan Cole. He had asked that it not. It did quote the chief executive directly. "We are not the bank we want to be when one of our employees decides in a public lobby that a customer does not look like he belongs at our counter." The statement read, "We did not catch the pattern in time. We are catching it now, and we are going to fix it." The story did not go away in 48 hours. By the end of the month, a banking industry trade publication had issued a long feature on what it called the First Dominion Standard, the practice of treating an isolated lobby incident as the visible edge of an underlying operational pattern, rather than as a personnel issue to be quietly resolved. 11 days after the boardroom meeting, Ryan sat across from Whitfield and the chief executive again. A formal letter of commendation had been placed on the table. So had a substantial discretionary bonus. "I don't want the bonus," Ryan said. The chief executive raised his eyebrows. "I want the equivalent amount redirected. A seed contribution to a restitution fund for the 18 customers identified in the brief administered independently with a published accounting at the end of the first year. The fund should cover any direct financial harm those customers suffered, and it should accompany a personal letter of apology from this company, signed by you, delivered by hand, with no non-disclosure attached. The bank should fund the ethics retraining out of its own operating budget, not out of a personal bonus. That should be standard, not a favor." "Tiban," the chief executive looked at him. "You're not making this easy on us, Mr. Cole. I'm trying to make it permanent. Easy is what put us in this room." The chief executive almost smiled. "All right. Both." They shook hands. Ryan walked out of the building, took the elevator down to the lobby, and went home. That evening he drove to a First Dominion branch in a quiet neighborhood north of the city, 11 miles from the downtown location. He walked in at 6:12 in the evening. He carried a single white envelope. Inside it was a fresh cashier's check reissued by Meridian's operations center the week before to replace the one Claire Whitmore had destroyed. The two halves of the original had gone into the audit's evidence file the same afternoon. Ryan had carried them out of the downtown branch. He had kept nothing of that morning for himself except the memory. The teller at the suburban branch was a young man with a buzz cut and a small enamel American flag pinned to his collar. Ryan slid the envelope across the counter. The teller opened it, opened a new window on his terminal, and went to work. "I can take care of that for you, sir. Give me just a moment." It took him 4 minutes. He printed a small acknowledgement slip, slid it across the counter, and thanked Ryan for his patience. Ryan thanked him back. The total time the transaction had taken from the moment he walked through the door to the moment he walked back out was less than 7 minutes. He sat in the parking lot for a while before he started the car. In the months that followed, the video of Claire Whitmore tearing the check at the downtown branch became against everyone's intention a training video. Marcus Bennett still owned the original clip. He had never sold it or signed anything. But the video, in raw form and in cleaner edited versions, began to appear in classroom modules, at banking compliance programs around the country, in trade associations, in graduate schools of business, and eventually in First Dominion's own new ethics training, with a brief introduction that named the date, the branch, the outcome, and the lesson. The lesson was not, in the end, about a single torn check. It was about a senior employee who had decided over a long period of time that her professional judgment was a license to choose which customers deserved her competence and which did not, and about a manager who had decided over the same period of time that protecting his branch's reputation was more important than protecting the people who walked through its doors. The check was the moment those two long decisions became visible to a lobby full of witnesses. Claire Whitmore did not work in banking again. She moved out of her apartment in Midtown 6 months after the incident and took a job at a paper supply distributor in a town an hour and a half outside Atlanta. Late in the following spring, she wrote a brief letter and put it in an envelope addressed to Ryan Cole. It did not contain an apology, not exactly. It contained 4 sentences in tight, controlled handwriting that said she had been thinking about that morning, and that she understood now what she had not understood then. Ryan read it once and put it in the bottom drawer of his desk, and after a while he stopped opening that drawer. Gerald Mason retired 2 months after his termination to a small house in North Florida that he had owned for many years. He told his neighbors he had taken an early package. He did not say from where. Lauren Hayes was promoted to the senior teller position at the reorganized downtown branch. She accepted on the condition that she would also serve on the new branch-level customer service review committee. Eleanor Briggs received a personal letter from the chief executive of First Dominion hand-delivered to her apartment, along with a full accounting of the restitution funds deposited into her account. She read the letter twice, set it on her kitchen table, and made herself a cup of tea. Ryan Cole went back to his quiet life. He took on a new contract 3 weeks later, a healthcare clearinghouse in North Carolina. He kept his evenings to himself. He let the public version of the story end with the video and the statement and the training module, and he did not seek a different ending for himself. On a quiet evening late in the year, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold beside him, he opened a small leather notebook he had carried with him on every contract since his wife had died. He thought about what she had told him in those last months about the 2 kinds of people in the world, the ones who decided who deserved kindness and the ones who simply gave it. Then he wrote 4 sentences across the top of a fresh page. The greatest power inside any service counter, he wrote, is not the power to refuse. It is the power to choose how a stranger is treated when no one knows yet who that stranger is. A single decision made in prejudice can end a career, and respect, in the end, begins in the small act of listening before judging. He closed the notebook. Outside the window of his small kitchen, the lights of Atlanta were already on for the night, and somewhere in the city, in a lobby that looked very much like every other lobby, a different teller at a different counter was deciding in the first 2 seconds of a transaction what kind of person was standing in front of her. Ryan did not know who she was. He hoped without expecting it that she would choose well.